A wounded dog ran into the frozen night, not to survive, but to save a child. He had no voice left, no strength to spare, only loyalty stronger than pain. The boy who once hurt him could only whisper, "Dear God, please let him live." A Navy SEAL stood in silence, realizing that courage does not always wear a uniform. This is the story of a small life that chose love, even when it had to pay the ultimate price. Where are you watching from today? Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more stories that heal. Winter arrived quietly in the northern town, settling over pine trees and frozen roofs like a held breath. Snow drifted down in pale sheets, soft enough to seem kind, cold enough to remind anyone paying attention that warmth was never guaranteed. It was chosen. Silas Ward had learned that lesson long ago. At 35, Silas moved through life with the restrained economy of a man who had once carried chaos on his back and learned how to set it down without making noise. He was tall and lean, his build athletic rather than bulky, shoulders squared by habit more than pride. His hair was cropped short, dark brown streaked faintly with gray that hadn't been there a few years ago. His face was clean-shaven, angular, with a faint scar cutting through one eyebrow, an old punctuation mark from a life he no longer explained. His eyes, gray-blue and steady, missed little. They held the calm of someone who had survived worse than winter. He lived alone at the edge of town, where the streetlights thinned and the forest began. Alone, that is, except for Coda. Coda was a 5-year-old German shepherd with a sable coat, brown fur threaded with black like smoke caught in motion. His amber eyes were alert but gentle, intelligent in a way that felt deliberate. He wore a simple black leather collar, no tags beyond the necessary. Coda didn't beg, didn't bark without reason. He watched, he listened, and when he chose to move, he did so with purpose. That afternoon, Coda sat by the front window, ears angled toward the road as if it were speaking a language only he could hear. Silas's phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. He glanced at the screen and exhaled slowly before answering. "Marina." Marina Wilder's voice came through fast and strained, already apologizing before she finished her first sentence. She was in her early 30s, a woman shaped by responsibility, slender but tense, with chestnut hair usually tied into a practical bun that never quite held. Her skin carried the pale exhaustion of too many late nights and early mornings. She loved her son fiercely, and lately, that love had been stretched thin by work that refused to wait. "They moved the deadline," she said. "I have to travel, starting tonight. I wouldn't ask if I had a choice." "Silas, I swear I wouldn't." Silas leaned against the counter, eyes flicking to Coda, whose ears twitched at Marina's voice. "How long?" he asked. 2, maybe 3 weeks. Nate's winter break just started. I can't take him with me." Silas didn't hesitate. "Bring him here?" There was a pause, then a shaky breath on the other end of the line. "Thank you," Marina said quietly. "You always do this, just show up." Silas allowed a faint smile. Someone has to. By late afternoon, Marina's car crunched into the driveway, tires breaking the smooth snow. She stepped out first, bundled in a long coat and scarf, moving with the hurried efficiency of someone racing a clock she couldn't see. Nate Wilder jumped out behind her. He was 10 years old, all sharp elbows and restless energy, with sandy brown hair that refused discipline and freckles scattered across his nose. His eyes, blue-green and bright, carried the stubborn confidence of a boy who hated being treated like a child and still needed someone to catch him when he fell. A backpack nearly swallowed his narrow frame. He bounded up the steps, then froze. Coda stood in the doorway. The dog didn't move, didn't bark. He simply looked at Nate with calm attention, tail low, posture relaxed, but alert. The kind of look that wasn't judging, just assessing. "That's a big dog," Nate said, lifting his chin. Coda tilted his head slightly, as if considering the statement. Silas stepped outside then, and Nate's face lit up. "Uncle Silas!" Silas caught him easily when Nate lunged into a hug. "Hey, kid," he said, voice warm. "You grow every time I see you?" Nate grinned, then glanced back at Coda, less sure now. Marina followed, rolling Nate's suitcase behind her. She looked at Silas with relief edged by guilt. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I really am." Silas shook his head. "Don't be." Inside, the house was warm and simple. Marina explained routines, food allergies, bedtimes, small worries parents never stopped carrying. Nate wandered, curious but guarded. Coda patted over and sniffed Nate's backpack, nudging it gently. "He's sniffing my stuff," Nate said, offended. "He's checking your reel," Silas replied. Coda sat, tail curling neatly around his paws. Marina hesitated. "He's good with kids?" "Better than most adults," Silas said. Dinner passed easily enough. Nate talked too much, then too little. Silas listened either way. Coda lay near Nate's chair, lifting his head whenever Nate's voice grew loud, as if reminding him of the room. Later, as Marina packed her final things, Nate stood at the window, watching the streetlight glow gold against the snow. "So, you're really going," he said. Marina rested a hand on his shoulder. "I'll call every day." Nate nodded, not trusting his voice. At that moment, Coda rose and moved closer to the window, ears sharp, body suddenly still. Silas noticed. Coda stared down the road with unusual intensity, as if something unseen had just brushed past the town. Silas felt a quiet tightening in his chest, the kind of instinct he had learned never to ignore. "Tomorrow's your last school day before break, right?" Silas said lightly. "Yeah, half day." "I'll walk you home," Silas said. Nate blinked. "You don't have to." "I want to." Marina turned, surprised but relieved. "That would make me feel better," she admitted. "The bend near the park gets slick." A knock sounded at the door. Deputy Cole stood outside, bundled in a thick jacket, badge catching the porch light. He was broad-shouldered, mid-40s, with a friendly face worn by cold air and responsibility. "Evening," Cole said. "Just a heads up, kids have been flying down Maple Bend on bikes. Nearly had an accident today." Silas nodded. "Thanks." As the door closed, Coda moved to Silas's side, posture alert. It was probably nothing. Later, Marina hugged Nate tightly. "Don't be a gremlin," she whispered. "I'm not," Nate muttered, voice thick. She kissed his forehead and turned to Silas. "Thank you." Her car pulled away, taillights fading into the snowy dark. Nate stood under the porch light, hands jammed into his pockets. Silas stayed beside him. Coda sat near Nate's foot, not touching, but close enough to share warmth. Nate looked down at the dog. Coda met his gaze, amber eyes steady and patient, like an old story waiting to be believed. Nate didn't pet him, but he didn't step away, and in a town where winter erased footprints overnight, that small pause was enough to mark the beginning of something neither of them yet understood. Morning arrived pale and clean, as if the night had erased everything it didn't like. Sunlight slid across the snow in thin gold lines, catching on rooftops and frozen branches. The town looked peaceful in that careful, fragile way that only winter towns ever did. Quiet enough to convince people that nothing bad could happen if everyone just behaved. Nate Wilder woke up with that thought somewhere behind his eyes. He lay in the guest bed at Silas's house, staring at the unfamiliar ceiling. The room smelled faintly of clean laundry and pine cleaner. For a few seconds, he forgot where he was. Then he remembered. Winter break had started. His mom was gone, and he was staying with his uncle. And the dog. Nate sat up. Coda lay on the floor near the door, curled neatly as if he had been placed there on purpose. His chest rose and fell in a slow, steady rhythm. One ear twitched when Nate moved, but his eyes stayed closed. For reasons Nate couldn't explain, that annoyed him. He slid out of bed and dressed quickly, yanking on jeans and a hoodie. When he stepped past Coda, the dog opened one amber eye, watched him for a second, then closed it again. Nate scowled. He thinks he owns the place, Nate decided. Downstairs, Silas was already awake. He stood at the kitchen counter, sleeves rolled up, making eggs with the quiet confidence of a man who had cooked in worse places than a warm house. In daylight, he looked even more like someone carved from habit-straight posture, calm movements, eyes already alert. "Morning," Silas said, without turning. Nate paused. "How did you know I was here?" Silas cracked an egg. "You stomp like you're mad at gravity." Nate didn't know whether to feel insulted or impressed. They ate breakfast together. Silas asked simple questions. School, friends, what Nate liked to read lately. Nate answered in short bursts, careful not to say too much. Every time he glanced at Coda, the dog seemed either asleep or looking somewhere else, which somehow felt worse. After breakfast, Silas pulled on his jacket. "Ready?" he asked. "For what?" "For walking you home." Nate frowned. "I said I usually walk with my friends." "And you still will," Silas replied. "I'm just nearby." Nate didn't argue, but the word nearby stuck in his chest like a pebble. Outside, the cold bit gently at their faces. Coda trotted ahead, leash loose, tail relaxed. He moved like he already knew the route, occasionally glancing back to make sure the humans were still where he'd left them. They reached the edge of the schoolyard just as kids began spilling out, voices loud against the snow. Nate spotted his friends immediately. Evan Chatter Brooks stood out as usual. Evan was a year older than Nate, tall for his age, with messy black hair that always fell into his eyes no matter how often teachers told him to cut it. He had a narrow face, sharp grin, and the kind of confidence that came from never thinking about consequences until they hit. His jacket was unzipped, despite the cold, as if winter itself wasn't allowed to tell him what to do. "There he is," Evan shouted when he saw Nate. "The Vacation King. Nate brightened and jogged over, forgetting Silas and Coda for a moment. The group gathered, laughing, shoving lightly, already halfway into some story about a teacher losing her keys. Silas stopped at a distance, leaning against the fence. Coda sat beside him, calm and watchful. Nate glanced back once, saw them there, and felt his stomach twist. He turned back to his friends, determined not to let it show. They started home together, boots crunching over packed snow. Evan walked backward, talking with his hands. So my cousin says he can build a ramp big enough to... Nate, watch where you're... The warning came too late. From around the bend near the park, a boy on a bike shot downhill, wheels humming fast over ice. The road narrowed there, trees crowding in, snowbanks tall and unforgiving. The cyclist swerved, trying to correct, but the speed was already wrong. Nate stepped sideways, laughing at something Evan had said. Then everything happened at once. A sharp bark cut through the noise. Coda lunged. He didn't crash into Nate. He didn't knock him down with force. Instead, he cut across Nate's path, shoulder brushing hard against Nate's legs as his jaws caught the strap of Nate's backpack. The pull was sudden. Nate stumbled, lost his footing, and went down into the snow with a surprised shout. The bike shot past where he had been standing, missing him by inches. For a heartbeat, there was nothing. No laughter, no shouting. Just the scrape of tires fading and Nate lying in the snow, breath knocked out of him. Then someone laughed. It was Evan. "Dude," Evan said, doubling over. "You just got taken out by a dog." A few others laughed too, not because it was funny, but because the fear had nowhere else to go. Nate pushed himself up, cheeks burning. His hoodie was smeared with gray slush. Snow clung to his jeans. He looked around, saw the bike disappearing down the road, saw Silas moving toward him fast. And then he saw Coda. The dog had stopped a few feet away, standing still, ears forward, eyes fixed on Nate with an intensity that felt almost worried. That look snapped something inside Nate. "What's wrong with you?" Nate shouted, yanking his backpack strap free. "Get away from me!" He raised his hand, not to hit, but to threaten, to reclaim control. Coda stepped back immediately, tail low, body calm. He didn't bark. He didn't bare his teeth. He simply watched Nate, then turned his head slightly, as if checking the road again. The laughter stung worse than the fall. Silas reached Nate and crouched beside him. "You hurt?" "No," Nate snapped, brushing snow off too hard. "Your dog knocked me over." Silas followed Nate's gaze to the road, then back to Coda. His jaw tightened, but his voice stayed level. "Stand up," he said gently. Nate did. His knees shook, though he refused to admit it. The kids drifted away, still chuckling. Evan throwing one last grin over his shoulder. "Nice save, man." Or not. Nate wanted the ground to open and swallow him. They walked home in silence. At the house, Nate kicked off his boots and stalked inside, leaving wet footprints across the floor. Coda padded in last, quiet as always. "Why did he do that?" Nate demanded, spinning on Silas. "He embarrassed me." Silas took off his jacket slowly. "He stopped you from getting hit." "That bike wasn't even that close." Silas met his eyes. It was close enough. Nate crossed his arms, shoulders tight. "I don't like him." The words landed heavier than Nate expected. Silas nodded once, absorbing it. "You don't have to like him." That wasn't the argument Nate wanted. Coda lay down near the door again, head on his paws, eyes half-lidded but awake. That afternoon, while Nate sulked in the living room pretending to read, Coda did something strange. He stood suddenly, walked to the front window, and pressed his nose lightly against the glass. He stayed there, unmoving, staring down the road where the bike had disappeared hours ago. Nate watched him from the couch, unease crawling up his spine. "What are you looking at?" Nate muttered. Coda didn't turn. For just a second, Nate had the unsettling thought that the dog wasn't watching the road as it was, but as it had been, or as it might be again. The thought lingered long after Coda finally lay down. That evening, Marina called. Nate complained immediately, voice sharp with unfairness. "He pushed me," Nate said. Everyone laughed. Marina frowned through the screen. "Pushed you how?" "Like on purpose." Silas didn't interrupt, but his silence felt like judgment to Nate. "I think he was trying to protect you," Marina said carefully. Nate's jaw clenched. "You always take his side." Marina sighed. "That's not true." But Nate had already tuned out. Later, after dinner, Silas sat beside Nate on the couch. "You don't have to forgive him," Silas said quietly. "But you should know, Coda doesn't do things without a reason." Nate didn't answer. Upstairs, he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling again, replaying the fall, the laughter, the look in Coda's eyes. Downstairs, Coda circled once before settling by the door, positioning himself where he could hear both the stairs and the street. As the house went quiet, snow began to fall again, soft and relentless. And somewhere between anger and embarrassment, Nate made a small, dangerous decision. If that dog wanted to be part of his life, Nate would make sure it regretted it. Snow had a way of making sound feel unnecessary. By the third morning at Silas's house, the world outside seemed wrapped in cotton, muted, patient, almost forgiving. Inside, however, Nate Wilder carried a knot that refused to loosen. It sat behind his ribs and pressed outward whenever he thought about the fall, the laughter, the way Coda's eyes had looked at him afterward, steady, unreadable, impossible to argue with. Nate did not like things he couldn't argue with. Silas kept the house running on simple rhythms. Wake up, eat warm food, shovel the walk, read for an hour, do something with your hands so your thoughts didn't run wild. He didn't announce these rules like a drill sergeant. He lived them and expected others to notice. Nate noticed and resisted. He sat at the kitchen table with a new book, propped open in front of him, pretending to read, while his eyes slid over the same paragraph again and again. The book was thick and glossy, its cover bright with characters every kid at school recognized. He had saved allowance money for it. Evan had bragged he got his early. Nate had wanted to be first at something for once. Coda lay near the back door, half asleep. His body looked relaxed, but his ears shifted subtly with every sound. The tick of the heater, the scrape of Nate's chair, the soft clink of Silas's mug against the counter. Silas watched the two of them from a distance, careful not to force peace where it wasn't ready. "Your friends coming by today?" he asked casually. Nate looked up, surprised. "How'd you know?" "You keep checking the clock," Silas said. "That's a waiting habit." Nate hesitated, then nodded. Evan said they might. Silas didn't comment. He rinsed his mug, dried it, and set it away. "I'll be in the garage later, if you need me." Nate waited until Silas's footsteps faded before he exhaled. By early afternoon, boots thudded on the porch. Laughter followed, sharp and careless. the kind that filled space without asking permission. Evan burst in first, cheeks red from cold, grin already locked in place. Up close, he looked even more like trouble. Tall for his age, narrow shoulders hunched in perpetual motion, dark hair falling into his eyes as if he liked not seeing consequences too clearly. "Vacation headquarters," Evan announced, stomping snow off his boots without bothering to take them off. Behind him came two other kids from school, whose names mattered less than their presence. They hovered near Evan, feeding off his energy. Nate stood straighter. "I got the book," he said, trying to sound casual. "Ooh," Evan said. "Let's see." They piled onto the living room floor, Nate at the center like he wanted. He held the book up, savoring the moment before opening it. The spine cracked. Not the good kind. Nate frowned and opened the cover fully. A jagged tear ran along the inside edge, deep enough to catch a finger. The corner of the first page was chewed ragged, uneven, unmistakably damaged. For a second, the room went silent. Then Evan leaned in, eyes lighting up. "Dude," he said slowly, "did your dog eat your book?" Laughter erupted. Nate's face burned. He flipped the page, hoping it would somehow fix itself. It didn't. The tear was worse than he remembered. He was sure he'd checked it before. He would have noticed. "It wasn't like this," Nate said. "I swear." Evan raised his hands. "Hey, I'm not judging. I had a hamster once, ate my homework." Another laugh. Nate snapped the book shut. His gaze shot to Coda, who had lifted his head and was watching from the doorway. The dog did not move. "Your dog did this," Nate said, voice shaking. "I know it." Evan smirked. "Guess your guard dog's got bad taste?" That was it. "Get out," Nate said. The laughter faltered. "What?" Evan asked. "I said get out," Nate repeated, louder now. The other kids looked between them, unsure. Evan shrugged and stood. "Relax. We were just messing around." They left in a flurry of boots and half-finished jokes, the door slamming behind them. The house fell quiet again. Nate stood alone in the living room, the book clenched in his hands like evidence of a crime no one would investigate. Coda remained where he was, eyes steady. "Did you do this?" Nate demanded. Coda rose slowly and approached, tail low, movements careful. He sniffed the book, then nudged it gently with his nose, as if trying to return something. Nate jerked it away. "Don't touch it!" Coda stopped immediately, confusion flickering across his face. He sat down, ears tilting back, not in fear, but in restraint. Silas appeared in the doorway, drawn by the raised voice. "What happened?" he asked. Nate spun toward him. "Your dog ruined my book." Silas took in the torn spine, the anger in Nate's eyes, the way Coda sat a little too still. "Coda," Silas said quietly. The dog looked up at him, attentive. "Did you get into Nate's things?" Coda didn't look away. He didn't whine or lower his head. He simply waited. Silas exhaled. "I don't think he did this on purpose." Nate's chest tightened. "You didn't even ask me." Silas met his gaze. "I'm asking now." "It mattered to me," Nate said, voice breaking despite himself. And everyone laughed. Silas nodded slowly. "I hear that." But he didn't apologize. And to Nate, that felt like choosing sides. That night, Nate called his mother. Marina's face appeared on the screen, hair pulled back, office lights too bright behind her. She looked tired, more tired than usual. "What's wrong?" she asked immediately. Nate told her everything. The fall, the book, the laughter, the dog. Marina listened, lips pressed together. "I think he was trying to protect you," she said finally. "Everyone keeps saying that," Nate snapped. "What if I don't care?" Marina's eyes softened. "You don't have to care, but blaming him won't fix how you feel." Nate ended the call early, throat tight. Upstairs, he lay on his bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the scene with the book. The tear, the laughter, Coda's nose nudging the cover. Downstairs, Coda paced once, then lay near the stairs, chin resting on his paws. Later that night, when the house had settled into sleep, Coda stood suddenly and walked to the front door. He sat there, unmoving, eyes fixed on the handle. After a long moment, he rose, padded back to the living room, and carefully picked up the torn book from where Nate had dropped it. Cradling it gently in his mouth, careful not to touch the damaged edge, Coda carried it to the foot of the stairs and set it down. Then he lay beside it, guarding it as if it were something precious. The next morning, Nate found the book there. He stopped halfway down the stairs. For a long moment, he just stared. Coda looked up at him, tail thumping once against the floor, soft, hopeful. Nate swallowed. He picked up the book. The tear was still there, but so was the quiet, undeniable truth that Coda hadn't hidden it, hadn't destroyed it further, hadn't walked away. He carried the book into the kitchen. Silas noticed. He didn't comment. They spent the day apart, circling each other carefully. Nate read. Silas worked. Coda moved between rooms like a shadow. That evening, Mrs. Ellery stopped by with a loaf of bread. She was an elderly woman with silver hair pulled into a neat bun, skin thin and papery, eyes sharp with years of watching rather than speaking. "I saw your dog the other day," she said to Silas, glancing at Coda. "He was running down the walk with something in his mouth. Looked worried." Nate's grip tightened on his book. Mrs. Ellery smiled kindly. "Dogs get anxious when kids forget things." Silas glanced at Nate. Nate said nothing. That night, lying in bed, Nate stared at the ceiling again. But this time, his anger felt different. Thinner. Like ice beginning to crack. He didn't forgive Coda. Not yet. But the certainty that the dog was his enemy had begun to melt. And somewhere in that melting space, something else unfamiliar and uncomfortable started to take shape. Regret. Winter did not loosen its grip. The days after the book incident passed in a slow, brittle hush, the kind that made even small sounds feel sharp. Nate moved through Silas's house like someone testing thin ice, careful where he stepped, alert for cracks that might expose what he didn't want to admit. He told himself he wasn't angry anymore. That wasn't true. What he felt was heavier than anger. It sat in his chest like a stone he didn't know how to throw away. Silas noticed the change immediately. At 35, Silas Ward had learned to read rooms the way other people read headlines. He had a face shaped by disciplined, clean lines, a square jaw, eyes that stayed calm even when the rest of the world raised its voice. He didn't pry when Nate went quiet. He adjusted. He spoke less. He listened more. "Snow's good today," Silas said one morning, handing Nate a mug of hot chocolate. "Good for packing." Nate shrugged. "I guess." They shoveled the driveway together in silence. Coda worked beside them. trotting back and forth with a steady rhythm, occasionally stopping to sit and watch Nate with that same patient attention that made Nate feel seen in a way he hadn't agreed to. Coda looked healthy, strong, exactly the way a dog should look, which somehow made Nate angrier. He couldn't shake the image of his friend's laughter or Evan's grin, or the way Silas hadn't immediately taken his side. The thought that Coda might not have meant to ruin the book didn't erase the fact that it had happened. And worse, it didn't erase the feeling that no one had chosen him. On the fourth afternoon after the incident, Evan came back. Nate heard the knock and felt his stomach tighten before his brain caught up. He opened the door to find Evan standing on the porch, hands shoved into his jacket pockets, breath puffing white in the cold. "Hey," Evan said. He glanced past Nate into the house. "You grounded or something?" Nate shook his head. "No." "Cool." Evan grinned. "We're going sledding behind the old mill." Nate hesitated. He thought of Silas in the garage, of Coda lying by the back door. "Give me a second," he said. Outside, the sky hung low and gray. The air smelled like metal and pine. Nate grabbed his coat and followed Evan down the steps, pulling the door shut behind him a little harder than necessary. As they walked, Evan talked about school rumors, about a kid who wiped out on the ice near the river, about how boring winter break was turning out to be. "Your uncle's intense," Evan said casually, "and that dog man, it's like it's always watching." Nate swallowed. "He's not even my dog." Evan glanced at him sideways. "Good." The word landed wrong. They reached the sledding hill and spent the next hour racing down icy slopes, laughing when they crashed, daring each other to go faster. For a while, Nate forgot the knot in his chest. Then Evan said, "So, did your dog ever apologize for eating your book?" Nate froze. "He didn't eat it," Nate snapped. "I don't know what he did." Evan raised an eyebrow. "Sure looked like teeth marks." The knot tightened again. That night, Nate lay awake long after Silas turned off the lights downstairs. The house creaked softly as it cooled. Wind rattled the bare branches outside. Coda lay near the foot of the stairs, as he always did, positioned where he could hear both the door and Nate's breathing above. Nate stared at the ceiling, jaw clenched. He always gets to be the good one, Nate thought. Everyone trusts him. An idea began to form. Not sharp, not sudden, slow, careful. It didn't feel like cruelty. It felt like fairness. The next day brought new snow, thick and heavy, muffling the world even more. Silas spent the morning on the phone, coordinating with Deputy Cole about safety barriers for the upcoming winter festival. His voice carried from the living room, steady and distracted. Nate took advantage of that. He sat on the floor with a box of old toys, plastic soldiers, a half-broken truck, a rope from a camping kit. Coda lay nearby, chin on his paws, watching. Nate glanced at him, then away. "Stay," Nate muttered. Coda stayed. That annoyed him too. Nate picked up the rope, turning it over in his hands. It wasn't strong enough to hurt anything. It was just rope. Practical. Useful. He didn't know exactly what he planned to do yet. He only knew he wanted Coda to feel just once what it was like to be embarrassed, powerless, trapped by someone else's decision. When Silas hung up the phone, Nate was already putting the toys away. I'm heading out later, Silas said. Couple hours, maybe less. Festival prep? Nate's heart beat faster. Can Evan come over? Silas considered. As long as you keep it calm. Nate nodded too quickly. By late afternoon, Evan and two other boys were back in the living room, boots thudding, voices loud. Silas grabbed his coat and keys. I'll be back before dark, he said. Food's in the fridge. Don't do anything stupid. Nate forced a smile. We won't. The door closed. The house felt different immediately, bigger, quieter, charged. Coda rose and moved to the center of the room, ears alert, eyes flicking between the boys. Evan smirked. He looks like he's guarding something. Nate swallowed. He's not. They lured Coda toward the back room with a toy. Nothing dramatic, nothing violent. Coda followed willingly, trusting. The kennel sat open against the wall, familiar and non-threatening. When Coda stepped inside, Nate closed the door. The click sounded louder than it should have. Coda turned, confused but calm, tail wagging once, as if expecting praise. Evan laughed. Nice. They didn't mean to make it cruel. They told themselves that. The water came out because someone suggested it. A joke, a way to scare him. The hose was cold from sitting in the garage. The spray hit Coda's fur in sharp bursts. Coda backed away, ears flattening, confusion giving way to stress. Stop, Nate said suddenly, but his voice was lost under laughter. The afternoon was colder than it looked. The wet clung to Coda's coat, seeping toward his skin. After a few minutes, maybe less, they got bored. Someone suggested video games. The hose was dropped. The kennel door stayed closed. By the time Silas returned, the boys were gone. Coda lay curled in the kennel, breathing shallowly, eyes dull. Nate felt a flicker of something unpleasant in his chest. He ignored it. That night, Nate started coughing. Silas noticed immediately, checked his forehead, brought soup, wrapped him in blankets. Nate drifted in and out of sleep, the room spinning slightly. Downstairs, Coda did not eat his dinner. Silas frowned, but assumed the dog was tired. Dogs didn't complain. Sometime after midnight, Coda tried to stand. His legs trembled beneath him. He sank back down, chest heaving, breath coming in shallow pulls. He lifted his head once, toward the stairs, toward Nate. Then he lay still, eyes open, listening, as if waiting for something to happen. Morning came gray and heavy. Nate woke with a sore throat and a pounding head. Silas kept him home, gave him medicine, checked his temperature. Nate lay on the couch, half watching cartoons he didn't care about. Coda remained by the door, unmoving. Why isn't he moving? Nate asked quietly. Silas glanced over. He's probably just tired. But Nate saw it now. The way Coda's sides barely rose, the way his ears no longer twitched at sound. Guilt crept in, slow and unwelcome. That evening, Marina called. Nate didn't tell her about the kennel, or the water, or the way Coda's eyes had looked last night. He told himself there would be time. But winter had a way of teaching people that waiting was not always a choice. As night fell again, the house settled into uneasy quiet. Nate lay awake, coughing softly. While downstairs, Coda gathered what strength he had left and shifted closer to the stairs, closer to the boy who still hadn't understood what he had done. The house did not sleep that night. It only pretended to. Snow pressed softly against the windows, thick and unbroken, dulling the world into something distant and unreachable. Inside, the air felt heavier than it should have, as if every breath had to push through regret before it could reach the lungs. Nate lay on the couch, wrapped in blankets, his body burning and freezing at the same time. His head throbbed. Each cough scraped his throat raw. He drifted in and out of shallow sleep, chased by half-formed dreams where laughter echoed without faces. Silas sat in the armchair nearby, boots still on, jacket draped over the back. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes were sharp, trained on Nate's face, counting breaths, measuring color. He had spent enough years in places where sickness turned deadly fast to know when to worry. "You okay, kid?" he asked quietly. Nate nodded without opening his eyes. The motion made his head spin. Silas reached over and pressed 2 fingers to Nate's forehead. Too warm. Not dangerous yet, but close enough to demand attention. "I'll get more water," Silas said. He stood, stretching stiffness from his shoulders, and glanced toward the back door out of habit. Coda was not there. That alone would not have worried him. Coda moved often at night, repositioning himself between doorways, checking the perimeter like a soldier changing watch. But something in Silas's chest tightened anyway. He found Coda in the kennel room. The dog lay curled tightly, his long frame drawn in on itself, fur still faintly damp beneath the thicker outer coat. His amber eyes were open, but unfocused. His breathing was shallow, too fast, too careful. Silas crouched instantly. "Coda," he murmured. The dog's ears twitched, but he did not rise. His tail barely moved. Silas's jaw clenched. He ran a hand along Coda's side, feeling the heat trapped under fur that should have been insulating warmth, not sickness. "How long have you been like this?" Silas asked softly, though he already suspected the answer. Coda did not answer. He only shifted his head slightly toward the hallway, toward Nate. Silas stood slowly, mind racing. He thought of the wet footprints he had noticed earlier, the way Coda had skipped dinner, the timing. Understanding settled in with a sickening weight. Silas returned to the living room and knelt beside Nate. "I need to step out for a few minutes," he said calmly. "I'm going to grab something for Coda. You can rest here. I'll be back before you know it." Nate's eyes fluttered open. "Coda, okay?" Silas hesitated, just a fraction too long. "He will be," Silas said. "Rest." Silas grabbed his coat and keys. He moved fast, but controlled, muscle memory taking over. Outside, the cold slapped his face hard enough to clear his thoughts. He started the truck, tires crunching into snow. The veterinary clinic was only 15 minutes away, but winter stretched time in cruel ways. Halfway down the road, Silas's phone rang. Deputy Cole. Silas answered immediately. "Ward?" "Sorry to bother you this late," Cole said. His voice carried tension now, stripped of its usual friendliness. "We've got a situation. Mrs. Ellery slipped on her steps, hit her head. Ambulance is on the way, but the road's bad. Any chance you could help clear the drive?" Silas closed his eyes briefly. "I'm on my way to the clinic," he said, "but I'll swing by." He turned the truck around. When Silas arrived at Mrs. Ellery's house, flashing lights painted the snow red and blue. Mrs. Ellery lay bundled on a stretcher, pale but conscious, silver hair loose around her face. She looked smaller than usual, fragile in a way Nate had never seen. Silas helped shovel and salt the path while the paramedics worked. He moved efficiently, silently, his mind split into one part here, one part already racing back home. As the ambulance pulled away, Mrs. Ellery reached out weakly and caught his sleeve. "Your dog," she said suddenly. Silas froze. "What about him?" "I saw him earlier," she whispered. "He was wet, cold, tried to follow your nephew up the steps yesterday. Had something in his mouth. Looked worried." Silas swallowed. "Thank you." Mrs. Ellery squeezed his hand once before the doors closed. Silas drove harder than he should have. Back at the house, the lights were still on. The door stood open. "Coda?" Silas called, heart hammering. No answer. Then he heard it, scratching, faint, desperate. He ran inside and followed the sound to the hallway. Coda was there on his feet somehow, legs trembling violently, claws scraping weakly at the front door. His breathing was ragged, his sides heaving. "Coda," Silas said sharply, dropping to his knees. The dog turned his head. His eyes met Silas's, focused now, burning with urgency. Then Coda turned back to the door and scraped again. Silas understood instantly. "Nate," he breathed. He spun and ran to the living room. Nate lay still on the couch, his face flushed, an alarming shade of red. His breathing was shallow, uneven. His lips trembled slightly with each exhale. Silas shook him gently. "Nate, hey, wake up." No response. Panic surged, but training held it back, wrapped it in control. Silas scooped Nate into his arms and grabbed his phone with the other hand, already dialing emergency services. He didn't wait for instructions. He moved. Coda followed, stumbling, collapsing, forcing himself upright again. By the time Silas reached the truck, Nate was barely conscious. Coda jumped into the back seat and collapsed immediately, body giving out at last. The drive to the hospital blurred into white lines and red lights. The emergency room was bright and loud and unforgiving. Doctors took Nate immediately. Silas stood frozen for a moment, arms empty, chest aching with the absence. Then someone shouted, "Dogs down." Silas turned just in time to see Coda being lifted onto a gurney by a young nurse with dark hair pulled into a messy ponytail. She looked no older than 25, her face serious but kind. "This your dog?" she asked. "Yes," Silas said. His voice came out rougher than he meant. "He collapsed in the parking lot," she said. "We'll do what we can." Her name tag read Hannah Pierce, a veterinary tech finishing a double shift, lean and quick-moving, eyes alert despite exhaustion. They wheeled Coda away. Silas stood alone between two corridors, one leading to his nephew, the other to his dog. For the first time in years, he didn't know where to go. As Silas stood there, torn in half, a strange thought surfaced, quiet but unshakable. Coda hadn't gone to the door because he was scared. He had gone because he knew. Not guessed, not hoped, knew. The certainty settled in Silas's chest like something ancient and immovable. And for the first time, the idea that animals might carry a sense beyond human logic no longer felt poetic. It felt factual. Hours passed. Eventually, a doctor emerged. Nate was stable. High fever, dehydration, complications, but they had arrived in time. Silas sagged against the wall, relief nearly dropping him to the floor. Then another figure appeared, Dr. Harlan Pike, the town's veterinary surgeon. He was in his late 50s, tall and narrow, with deeply lined features and steel gray hair combed back with military neatness. His eyes were tired but precise, the eyes of a man who had seen too many good animals hurt by bad luck and worse people. "Your dog's strong," Pike said. "Hypothermia, infection, exhaustion. He shouldn't have been able to do what he did tonight." Silas nodded, throat tight. "But he did," Pike continued, "because he had a reason." Nate woke just before dawn. The room smelled like antiseptic and quiet. His head felt clearer now, though heavy with shame he hadn't yet named. Marina sat at his bedside, her face pale, eyes red. She grabbed his hand the moment his eyes opened. "You scared me," she whispered. Nate swallowed. "Coda?" Marina's breath hitched. He's being treated. He saved you." The words landed like a blow, saved him. Nate turned his face away and began to cry. Not loud, not dramatic, just the steady, breaking sound of a child realizing the weight of his actions. Coda survived the night, barely. But as the sun rose over the snowbound town, painting the world gold once more, Silas sat beside his dog's recovery crate and rested a hand on Coda's head. "You ran through the dark for him," Silas murmured. "Didn't you?" Coda's tail thumped weakly once. Outside, winter remained cold and indifferent. Inside, something had shifted forever. Morning came without ceremony. Light seeped through the hospital blinds in thin, careful stripes, touching the edge of the bed where Nate lay. The machines hummed softly, doing their patient work. Somewhere down the hall, a cart rolled, a voice murmured, a door sighed shut. Life continued, slow, stubborn, ordinary. Nate opened his eyes and felt the weight of everything he had not said. His throat ached, dry and raw. His head felt clearer now, but his chest was heavy in a way fever had nothing to do with. He turned his face toward the window and watched snow drift past, each flake falling alone, each one identical until it wasn't. Marina sat in the chair beside him, curled forward with exhaustion. Her chestnut hair had come loose from its bun, soft strands brushing her cheeks. She wore yesterday's sweater, and none of yesterday's certainty. When Nate shifted, she startled awake and leaned forward instantly. "Nate," she whispered, her voice breaking around his name. "Hey, I'm here." He nodded. "I know." She searched his face the way mothers do, counting breaths, measuring color, checking for cracks that might let her fear escape. "You gave us a scare," she said, trying for lightness and failing. Her eyes were red, rimmed with sleepless worry. Nate swallowed. "Mom, Coda." The name came out like a bruise. Marina closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, the truth was there unsoftened. "He's alive," she said. "He's stable. Your uncle's with him now." Nate turned his face away. The tears came anyway, hot, silent, unstoppable. He pressed his fist against his mouth, but the sound slipped through. "I didn't mean to," he whispered. "I just—" Marina stood and wrapped her arms around him, holding him the way she had when he was small enough to believe pain could be outrun. "I know," she said into his hair. "But not meaning to doesn't make it disappear. It just means you still get to choose what comes next." That was worse than being yelled at. Silas sat in the veterinary wing on a hard plastic chair that had no interest in comfort. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped. The lights here were warmer than the ER's, the air smelling faintly of antiseptic and fur. Coda lay inside a recovery crate a few feet away, blankets tucked around his long body. Tubes ran from his foreleg, delivering warmth and fluid. His breathing was steady now, shallow but even. Dr. Harlan Pike stood nearby, reviewing a chart. Up close, Pike looked carved from time. His frame was tall and narrow, his back straight despite the years. His steel-gray hair was combed back neatly, and his face carried deep lines around the eyes and mouth marks left by a lifetime of hard truths and quiet mercy. He spoke plainly because he saw no value in ornament. "He's not out of danger yet," Pike said, not looking up. "But he's past the worst of it." Silas nodded. He shouldn't have had to do what he did. Pike finally met his eyes. Most good ones shouldn't. Silas rested a hand against the crate. Coda's ear twitched faintly at the contact. "He knew," Silas said quietly. It wasn't a question. Pike considered that. "I've worked with animals my whole life," he said. "They notice patterns we ignore. Smells, sounds, changes in breathing. Call it instinct if you want. Call it something else if it helps you sleep." Silas didn't respond. He wasn't looking for language that helped him sleep. Nate was discharged late. That afternoon, he walked slowly, still weak, clutching Marina's hand like it might disappear if he let go. The cold air outside felt sharp and clean in his lungs, as if winter itself had pressed a reset button. They didn't go home. Marina parked at the veterinary clinic instead. Nate stared at the building, heart pounding harder with each step toward the door. He hadn't asked to come. He hadn't been told to. He had chosen. Inside, Silas looked up as they entered. He stood immediately, relief and restraint crossing his face in equal measure. "Hey, kid," he said gently. Nate nodded, unable to meet his eyes. "Is he?" Silas stepped aside. Coda lay in the crate, eyes half open. His coat had been cleaned, brushed back into familiar lines, though he looked smaller somehow, like part of him had stayed out in the snow. Nate froze. For a moment, he was 10 years old again, in the simplest way, overwhelmed, unarmored, honest. "I'm sorry," he said. The words fell into the room and stayed there. "I'm so sorry," Nate repeated, voice cracking. I didn't know it would." He shook his head. "I was mad and embarrassed, and I wanted him to feel it too." Silas watched without interrupting. Marina stayed quiet, tears slipping down her cheeks. Nate took a step closer to the crate. His hands trembled. "I didn't hate you," he whispered to Coda. "I just didn't want to feel stupid." Coda lifted his head a fraction. His amber eyes focused, slow but unmistakable. His tail thumped once against the blanket. That was all. It felt like forgiveness anyway. As Nate stood there, heart racing, something strange happened. Coda shifted, gathering effort that clearly cost him. With deliberate care, he nudged the corner of the crate where Nate stood, just once, light as breath. Not to reach him, to steady him. The gesture was small, almost nothing, and yet Nate felt it like a hand on his back, holding him upright when he wasn't sure he could stand on his own. Dr. Pike cleared his throat. He'll need rest, weeks of it, and no more cold. Nate nodded quickly. I'll help. Pike raised an eyebrow. Helping looks different than promising. Nate swallowed. I know. They returned home that evening. The house changed by absence and return. Coda stayed at the clinic overnight for monitoring. The silence he left behind felt loud. Nate moved through the rooms carefully, noticing things he had ignored before. The way the stairs creaked, the place by the door where Coda always lay, the water bowl by the sink. He picked up the torn book from the shelf and held it for a long time. Then he sat down and taped the spine as best he could, smoothing the edges with deliberate care. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't hidden. It was repaired. Silas watched from the doorway, saying nothing. Later, Marina packed her bag. I have to go back tomorrow, she said quietly, but I'll come back as soon as I can. Nate nodded. I know. She hesitated, then added, Your uncle told me everything. Nate stiffened. And? He asked. And I'm proud of you for telling the truth, Marina said. That doesn't erase what happened, but it matters. She hugged him tightly, longer than usual. That night, Nate couldn't sleep. He lay in bed listening to the house breathe. When sleep finally came, it brought dreams that didn't chase him, dreams that waited. Coda came home 2 days later. He walked slowly, stiff but determined, tail wagging with careful optimism. Nate held the door open, heart in his throat, and waited. Coda crossed the threshold and stopped. He looked up at Nate. Nate knelt. Hey, he said softly. I'm here. Coda stepped forward and pressed his head gently into Nate's chest. Nate wrapped his arms around him and cried. Not because he was sad, but because he wasn't alone anymore. Outside, snow fell again, quiet and clean. Inside, something broken had not been forgotten. It had been forgiven. Winter did not leave all at once. It loosened, inch by careful inch, the way a clenched fist relaxes only after it learns there is nothing left to strike. In the days after Coda came home, the house learned new rhythms, quieter ones, slower ones, the kind that ask permission before moving. Nate followed the rules Dr. Pike had given them with a seriousness that surprised even himself. No cold floors for Coda. No long walks. No excitement. Food measured. Water warmed. Blankets changed before they smelled of yesterday. Nate did not complain. He woke early each morning and padded downstairs in socks, checking on Coda before checking on anything else. Sometimes Coda slept deeply, breath steady, paws twitching as if he were chasing something in a dream. Other times his eyes opened when Nate entered, and his tail would thump once, gentle as a heartbeat. Those were the mornings Nate breathed easiest. Silas watched from the edges. He did not interfere. He did not instruct. He observed the way he had once observed recruits learning a skill they would need to survive. Nate moved with care now, hands slower, voice softer. He spoke to Coda as if words mattered even when they were not understood. They did. By the end of the week, the town began to thaw into motion again. The Winter Light Festival, postponed after the storm, returned to the calendar. Strings of bulbs were rehung. Booths rose along the square. Music tested its courage in cold air. Marina called every night. Her face on the screen looked steadier now, though the tiredness never fully left her eyes. She listened as Nate talked, not with the rush of before, but with a new patience, letting him find his way through sentences that bent toward honesty. "I'll be back in a few days," she said one evening, "if that's okay." Nate nodded. "Yeah." He hesitated, then added, "Uncle Silas is taking care of Coda." Marina smiled. "I know, he always does." The night before the festival, snow fell again light and clean, like a blessing that did not ask to be believed. Nate sat at the kitchen table with his book, the spine neatly taped, the tear no longer hidden. He traced the edge of the repair with his thumb, thinking about how damage did not disappear just because it was mended. Silas poured cocoa and set a mug beside him. "You did good work there," Silas said. Nate shrugged. "It still looks broken." "Most important things do," Silas replied. "They still work." Coda lay by the heater, chin on his paws. He lifted his head at the sound of Silas's voice and watched them both, as if committing the moment to memory. The festival arrived with a hush and a glow. Lights bloomed across the square like constellations brought down to earth. Families gathered, bundled and laughing. The air smelled of sugar and pine and something fried that promised warmth. Nate walked carefully beside Coda, leash loose in his hand. Coda moved slowly, still healing, but his posture was proud, his eyes alert. People smiled when they saw him. A few knelt to greet him, hands gentle, voices soft. "That's the dog," someone murmured. "The one from the storm?" Nate heard it and felt something inside his chest straighten. They stopped at the edge of the square where music drifted low and steady. Nate watched children skate, watched parents clap, watched the way the lights reflected in Coda's amber eyes. For a moment, everything felt right. Then Nate saw Evan. Evan stood near the cocoa stand, hands shoved into his pockets, posture casual as ever. He noticed Nate and hesitated. The grin he usually wore did not come easily this time. Nate felt the old knot tighten. He could have turned away, pretended not to see, let winter cover the tracks. Instead, he walked over. Evan blinked. "Hey, hey," Nate said. They stood in awkward silence, steam from their breaths mingling. "So, your dog okay?" Evan asked finally, trying for casual and missing. Nate nodded. "Yeah, he saved my life." The words sounded strange out loud, heavy, true. Evan shifted his weight. "That's cool, I guess." Nate met his eyes. "I was wrong about a lot of stuff." Evan looked away, then back. "I was kind of a jerk." Nate almost laughed. "Yeah." Evan gave a small smile. "Your dog's different." "He is," Nate said. They stood there a moment longer. Then Evan nodded once and drifted back toward the crowd. Nate exhaled. Coda looked up at him, tail wagging faintly, as if approving the choice. As they turned back toward the lights, Coda stopped. He stood very still, ears forward, gaze fixed on the far end of the square where the crowd thinned and the road disappeared into shadow. For a heartbeat, the noise around them seemed to dim. Nate followed his line of sight, but saw nothing. "Coda?" he whispered. Coda did not move. Then, slowly, he relaxed. Tension easing from his body as if something unseen had passed by without leaving a mark. Nate felt a shiver he could not explain. The moment faded. The lights brightened again. But the sense that Coda had noticed something beyond the present stayed with him. The next morning dawned pale and quiet. Silas packed early, movements efficient, practiced. Nate sat on the stairs and watched, dread creeping in with each folded shirt. "You have to go today?" Nate asked. Silas nodded. "For a bit. Work." Nate swallowed. "How long?" Silas paused. "Not long, but long enough." Coda lay nearby, head up, watching Silas with an understanding that went beyond routine. Nate stood and walked over, kneeling in front of Coda. "I'll take care of you," he said softly, "until Uncle Silas gets back." Coda pressed his nose into Nate's shoulder, steady and warm. Marina arrived an hour later, suitcase in hand, eyes bright with relief when she saw Nate standing on his own 2 feet. "You look better," she said, pulling him into a hug. "I am," Nate replied, "mostly." She knelt to greet Coda, careful and reverent. "Thank you," she whispered to him, as if he were human. Coda wagged his tail once. The goodbyes were quiet. Silas crouched in front of Nate, hands on the boy's shoulders. "You did something hard," he said. "You faced it. Remember that." Nate nodded, throat tight. "When can I come visit?" Silas smiled, small, real. "Whenever you want. You've got a place with us." Nate wrapped his arms around Coda's neck, burying his face in warm fur. "I'll see you soon," he whispered. "I promise." Coda licked his cheek, slow and deliberate. Silas shouldered his bag and headed for the door. He paused once, looking back at the 2 of them, boy and dog, stitched together by something winter could not break. Outside, the truck pulled away, tires crunching softly over snow. Nate stood in the doorway until it disappeared. He did not cry. He held the leash, felt the weight of responsibility in his small hand, and stepped forward. Winter had not taken everything. Some things it had given back changed, but stronger. And as the door closed behind him, Nate understood that growing up did not mean leaving things behind. Sometimes it meant choosing to carry them with care. Sometimes miracles do not arrive with thunder or light. Sometimes they arrive quietly, on 4 tired legs, through falling snow, with a heart that refuses to give up, even when the body wants to. This story is not only about a boy, a soldier, and a dog. It is about the unseen hand that moves when love chooses sacrifice. Some call it instinct, some call it fate, and some of us call it God. Perhaps God does not always speak in words we can hear. Perhaps he speaks through loyalty that runs into the dark, through forgiveness that arrives before an apology, through a second chance given when we least deserve it, but need it the most. In our daily lives, we rush, we judge, we react before we understand. And yet, every day, we are surrounded by small miracles asking only one thing from us: to slow down and choose compassion. If this story touched your heart, let it remind you to look closer at the quiet acts of love around you. The people who protect you without being asked. The chances you are given to make things right. The moments when mercy shows up, disguised as responsibility. Please take a moment to share this story with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment and tell us what part moved you most, or share a story from your own life where you felt something greater than coincidence at work. And if you believe in stories that carry meaning, growth, and redemption, consider subscribing to this channel so we can continue walking this path together. May God bless you and your family. May He protect those who are hurting, guide those who feel lost, and soften hearts that need healing. And may you never miss the miracle that is quietly standing beside you, waiting to be seen